This is part 2 of a 2-part series on the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. If you haven't watched the first one, I suggest you do so to avoid any confusion that may occur. We will go over the battle again, with no fog of war this time, and from a Japanese perspective. This will help the viewer get a clear picture of what truly transpired during that chaotic and confusing battle. The Japanese were initially caught by surprise when the Allies landed on Guadalcanal on August 7th. Despite this, their quick and bold response got them a tremendous victory at Savo Island and nearly derailed the American campaign. After seeing that the American transports had withdrawn and that the Marines on shore had seemingly been abandoned, the Japanese response quickly became lackluster. Japanese intelligence estimated some 2,000 dispirited troops were left on the island, clearly not a threat. Maybe this had all just been a raid. Admiral Yamamoto was not so optimistic and was gravely concerned at what he saw. It may have been a raid, but if the Americans established themselves and made the airfield on Guadalcanal operational, it would pose a strategic threat to their hold on the Solomon Islands. Whatever Marines were left on the island had to be pushed out immediately. Therefore, he decided on a grand offensive. Reinforcements would be sent to the island to recapture the airfield with the full backing of his combined fleet. The code name was Operation KA. This was Japan's first full-scale effort to retake Guadalcanal. For this operation, Yamamoto counted on a powerful order of battle. He had 2 major task forces he planned on sending: Admiral Kondo's powerful 2nd Fleet and the 3rd Fleet under Vice Admiral Nagumo, also known as the Kido Butai. The newly reconstituted Kido Butai centered on the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, along with the light carrier Zuiho. Zuiho wasn't available, so Rujo took her place. Despite the disaster at Midway, Admiral Nagumo still retained his position as commander of the Mobile Striking Force. Thus, Eastern Solomons would be a rematch between him and Vice Admiral Fletcher. The 3 carriers were at full strength and were coming into the battle with 177 aircraft. A key lesson taken from Midway was the need for an advance warning of an airstrike. This advanced force role would be given to Kondo's 2nd Fleet and would operate 100 to 150 miles in front of Nagumo's carriers. This served 3 purposes. They could give early warnings of an incoming airstrike to Nagumo, or could serve as a magnet and absorb airstrikes intended for the main carriers. Lastly, it was hoped they could finish off any American ships that had been crippled by Nagumo's airstrikes. And as a final measure for early warnings, radar had finally been installed under Shokaku. However, the operators were still getting acquainted with this new system, and their inexperience would soon show. Yamamoto gave Nagumo and Kondo their orders. They needed to exploit their recent victory of Savo Island with a major push to dislodge the American force off the island. A convoy of 3 transports carrying 1,500 troops under Rear Admiral Tanaka was to depart for Guadalcanal. Kido Butai and Kondo's advance force would play the primary role of protecting him. Their main objective was to support the convoy, but if it seems a little funny that a whole fleet is coming out in force to escort such a small landing force, it's because it is. You see, the reality was that Admiral Yamamoto saw this more as an opportunity to avenge Midway than to provide support for a convoy. He hoped a decisive clash would come from this operation where he could finally sink those darn American carriers. Therefore, the real objectives were the following. First and foremost, wipe out any American naval forces supporting Guadalcanal. And secondly, sure, provide air support for the convoy. But as you can see, it's not really a priority from their perspective. Given their orders, both commanders soon made arrangements to depart. Kondo left on the 11th and Nagumo on the 16th. Now, it can be recalled that as late as the 21st, Allied intelligence continued to place Nagumo in home waters. This leads to an all-important question: why was American intelligence so wrong? Well, That's something that I feel is often overlooked during this battle, and it is the noteworthy efforts of the Japanese to increase their communication security, which ended up paying a handsome reward. The Japanese had already begun implementing security measures to strengthen their radio communications prior to Operation Watchtower. There's no evidence to suggest that these changes were a result of Midway. As a matter of fact, the Japanese still believed their codes to be unbreakable. Instead, it seems that these changes were just a result of being prudent. They've been at war for 9 months now, and they figured, hey, we should tighten up our communication security regularly. On May 28th, they changed their main fleet code from JN-25B to JN-25C. It didn't stop the disaster of Midway from happening, but it did put the codebreakers in the dark for a while. Just when the codebreakers were getting some breakthroughs, they changed their codes again to JN-25D on August 15th. On top of this, they attempted other measures. They changed their radio call signs and used special unbroken codes to report on Allied activities in the Solomons. They had their major units go on radio silence, and as was speculated, they did try their hand at radio deception, having other units send messages as if they were carriers. The combination of all these efforts cannot be minimized, for as we saw, from August 15th, the codebreakers were in the dark at a crucial time to give an advance warning to Fletcher. Although they weren't impeded completely, radio analysis was able to at least conclude rather accurately the composition of the Japanese forces. But as we saw, intelligence was always a step behind when it came regarding to their movements and intentions. But there was one more ace up the sleeve the Americans had, which could have possibly offset all of this. One of the codes that remained broken and continued to be read on a regular basis were the ones used by the port director at Truk. He conveniently registered every ship that entered and left the port. It was believed the carriers, after such a long journey from Japan, would port in Truk for replenishment and refueling before heading to battle. Privy to all this, they could then give a more accurate warning to Fletcher. Interestingly enough, the plan should have worked because it was exactly what Nagumo had planned on doing. However, as Nagumo was heading south, he decided to cancel his scheduled stop at Truk and instead refuel at sea. That's why, on August 23rd, with no information of Nagumo's arrival in Truk, they assumed the carriers to still be north of Truk, when in reality, they were only 300 miles north of Fletcher. So, did all these efforts of changing their naval codes, call signs, and attempts at radio deception work? Well, I would say to some degree, yes. It wasn't perfect, but the uncertainty it created led to radio analysts giving Fletcher flawed intelligence that deluded him into thinking it was safe to refuel the Wasp right before the battle. Thus, when Fletcher was confronted by Nagumo on the 24th, we can say that, thanks to all these efforts, the Japanese had at least achieved tactical surprise. A noteworthy achievement. As Kondo and Nagumo were making their way south, the Japanese forces at Truk and Rabaul had not been completely idle. They had been conducting small raids on Henderson Field and discreetly landing small groups of infantry on the island. On August 18th, 917 men of the elite Ichiki detachment were landed on the island undetected by the Allies. The hot-headed commander, rather than waiting for reinforcements, decided to attack. Of course, he was not met by 2,000 dispirited troops, but by 11,000 well-dug-in Marines. His force was obliterated at the Battle of the Tenaru River. The news of this defeat sent shockwaves up the chain of command. The following day, a submarine spotted and warned the Imperial Navy that 2 transports were heading to Guadalcanal. All that was available was a destroyer, and it would prove to be enough. Although the Kawakaze was not able to get to the transports, she did attack a pair of escorts and sunk the destroyer Blue. The recent convoys encountered and the defeat of Ichiki's detachment dispelled the notion that this had all just been a raid and showed that the Americans were committed on staying. The next discovery showed them that they would be committed to battle. On August 20th, American carriers were discovered off Guadalcanal, which couldn't have made Yamamoto happier. He would have his decisive battle after all. But the second revelation wasn't so good. American aircraft had landed on Guadalcanal's airfield. As Yamamoto had feared, the Americans now had an operating airbase, essentially an unsinkable carrier. The next 2 days in the lead up towards battle, the Japanese would lose 2 search planes that ran across Fletcher's carriers. The presence of carriers and an operating enemy airfield understandably worried Tanaka and posed the question, who was going to provide air cover for him? That task would come from Rabaul. Starting on August 22nd, Rabaul's airbase would provide air support, but by offensive means rather than defensive. In other words, they would neutralize Henderson Field, and thus Tanaka wouldn't have anything to worry about. So, on the 22nd, they sent an airstrike, but it encountered bad weather and forced it to return. Not a great start to their grand scheme, but they would try again the next day. On the 23rd, Tanaka slowly inched south towards Guadalcanal. Rabaul's airstrike took off, but once again, bad weather forced them back. At this point, the commander of Rabaul suggested to Nagumo that maybe he should provide air support for Tanaka. Yamamoto quickly intervened and told him it was out of the question. He didn't want his carriers to reveal their presence prematurely by defending a convoy. He needed to keep them hidden and in reserve to attack the American carriers, which was the main target. However, the issue of Tanaka's protection remained unanswered, so Yamamoto decided on a compromise. If the morning of August 24th passed without the discovery of enemy carriers, then the Japanese would shift their focus and provide air cover for the convoy. Later that afternoon, Tanaka realized he was being shadowed by enemy aircraft, so he pulled back. A wise decision because it caused both air groups launched that day to miss him. Unknown to the Japanese, the odds were greatly shifting in their favor that evening. Due to misleading intelligence Fletcher was receiving, he decided to detach the Wasp, a third of his carrier strength, to refuel. Thus, Japanese air strength on the morning of the 24th would be superior to the Americans. 177 aircraft versus 153. But we will see that they would squander that advantage when they detached the Rujo to support Tanaka, and thus the odds became equal. Alright, so now we arrive at the day of battle, August 24th. Much to Fletcher's surprise, Nagumo and his carriers were not 1,300 miles away, but instead only 450 miles north of him and closing. Rujo was detached that morning as Yamamoto's promise to provide air cover to the convoy. Rujo was scheduled to strike Guadalcanal in conjunction with Rabaul's scheduled airstrike for that day. But guess what? That's right, yet again, bad weather prevented Rabaul from launching an attack. Thus, Rujo's puny airstrike went ahead alone and struck Henderson, causing negligible damage. She would eventually be spotted by American search planes and get Fletcher's undesired attention centered on her throughout the afternoon. As we saw, the morning of the 24th was a chaotic one for Fletcher, as he only received fragments of the whole picture. Now we can see what was really occurring when he was presented with his dilemmas. The American morning search was only able to discover the convoy's covering force, Rujo, and elements of Kondo's advance force, but it failed at finding Tanaka and, more crucially, Nagumo. One PBY had gotten close though. It was this one, PBY 8V37. It ran into Kido Butai's combat air patrol and was chased off before it had a chance to spot Nagumo's carriers. With that, Fletcher's opportunity of finding Nagumo that morning had disappeared. Rujo was the only carrier that had been spotted and would receive Fletcher's wrath later on. If Fletcher felt disappointed at the performance of his morning air search and their failure to discover Nagumo's carriers, he would at least be comforted by the fact that the Japanese were equally having a hard time in finding him. Task Force 61 detected and destroyed 3 search planes that morning and afternoon. The first 2 were destroyed so quickly they weren't able to send out a report. Only the 3rd scout succeeded, and partially at that. All he was able to send out before being destroyed was the following. Spotted large enemy force being pursued by enemy fighters, 1400. And that was it. No further information followed. But it was enough for Nagumo's air officer. Given the known course and speed of the aircraft, the officer was able to accurately estimate where it had been intercepted. And bingo, this was where the American carriers were estimated to be. And surprisingly, it was very accurate, only 10 miles off Fletcher's actual location. Nagumo had already painfully learned the #1 rule in carrier warfare: strike first. So, trusting the accuracy of his staff, he boldly ordered his airstrike at this unconfirmed location. Nagumo planned on launching 3 separate waves of airstrikes on the Americans. The first 2 would be composed of only dive bombers with escorting fighters. These 2 waves would soften up the target. The last strike would be of the much feared carrier killer torpedo bombers, who would finish off the crippled targets. One of the harsh lessons learned from Midway was that their torpedo bombers would suffer heavy losses in airstrikes. It was hoped that by launching them at the end, it would reduce losses as they would face less resistance from damaged carriers. So, the first strike of 27 Vals and 15 Zeros took off at 1500. At this point, Nagumo was winning the battle. He had found the enemy first and had launched first. And better yet, the Americans had committed their main strike at the Rujo, which splendidly, although not intentionally, had become bait for Fletcher. Just when Nagumo was feeling content with how things were going, his optimism was shattered at 1515 with the words, "Hell divers." Shokaku's lookouts had spotted dive bombers descending on his flagship. Oh no, flashbacks of Midway were surely running through Nagumo's mind. But fortunately for him, he was not being attacked by a major airstrike, but instead just by 2 dive bombers. What happened was that 2 scout planes from Enterprise's afternoon search had finally discovered Kido Butai. They decided they would conduct a sneak attack on the carrier. Although they were detected by Shokaku's radar, the inexperienced technicians weren't able to warn the bridge in time. No fighters intercepted the pair, and Nagumo only realized he was about to be attacked when they were already diving on him. Thankfully for him, the Shokaku quickly turned to starboard and only 2 near misses were scored. Panic ensued, fighters were scrambled, but all these actions proved unnecessary, as the worst had already passed. The 2 SBDs left the scene after their bombing run and carefully sent out their report with a position and a course. But, in an all too common occurrence, the bad atmospheric conditions in the South Pacific garbled their message. So much so that only a fraction was received by Fletcher. Thus, as we can see, because of this remarkable communication failure, Fletcher was denied the opportunity to strike at Nagumo's carriers with his reserve strike. Instead, he had to waste it on the Rujo, a ship that was already destroyed. Nagumo breathed a sigh of relief as he had just narrowly avoided a disaster. Consequently, he quickly ordered the second wave to launch. So now we have 2 airstrikes heading towards the Americans, and as we saw, the first struck Fletcher and heavily damaged the Enterprise. But the second airstrike never arrived. So now, the all-important question: what happened with the second strike? Well, right before they took off, a 4th Japanese scout plane had reacquired contact with Task Force 61. This scout gave Nagumo the first concrete report of enemy carriers, but unfortunately, it mistakenly placed them about 50 miles further south of their actual position. Given these new coordinates, Takahashi headed southeast with the expectation of finding the enemy carriers at 1800 hours. Now, a chain of tragic events occur from the Japanese perspective. As we saw, communication failures were a recurring theme in this battle, and it did not only occur to the Americans, but to the Japanese as well. As Takahashi headed southeast, yet another search plane discovered Fletcher, and this time accurately reported its position. Nagumo rebroadcasted these new coordinates, which would tell Takahashi that the carriers were actually to the east of him. Furthermore, at 1730, Lieutenant Commander Seki gives his post-strike report, with again an accurate location, which is also rebroadcasted later by the Shokaku. As incredible as it may sound, Takahashi never received any of these messages. He continued on with his original inaccurate coordinates and ended up 83 miles south of Fletcher. To add insult to injury, members of his air group actually received these messages, but wrongly assumed their commander had as well. No one took the initiative to check if their commander was receiving the messages or not. Takahashi then decided to head west and search there. But it was all in vain as he discovered nothing. He eventually had to call the strike off and head back home. To top off this failure, the air group ended up losing 5 dive bombers operationally. With the failure to find the carriers again, and with darkness settling in, Nagumo declined sending the deadly reserve strike of torpedo bombers. But they probably wouldn't have been necessary, for if Takahashi had found the Americans, he would have arrived when the Enterprise was hopelessly stuck going in circles. It's very likely she would have been finished. The failure of Takahashi to find the American carriers and finish off the Enterprise would be the most critical failure of the Japanese in this battle. Although Takahashi had failed in his task, other motions were at play to destroy the American flat tops. The advance force and a detached vanguard force had surged forward as soon as Task Force 61's presence had been revealed. At 1900 hours, Nagumo was wrongly told by Seki and survivors of the first airstrike that they had hit and damaged not 1, but 2 carriers. It was hoped that Kondo could catch and finish off any crippled enemy ships that remained. Yet, as darkness fell, so did their hope for a surface engagement. Kondo continued south, but found no enemy carriers. At 2330, he gave up and called off the pursuit. It was evident the Americans had retreated. They were only half right in their conclusions. The Americans had indeed fled, but not as heavily damaged as believed. Only Enterprise had been seriously hurt. Regardless, their belief was that American carrier air power had been eliminated. Only one more obstacle remained to be overcome: Henderson Field. But here, some erroneous information is going to lead them to making a terrible decision. Yamamoto is informed about Ryujo's destruction, and as depressing as that was, he is comforted by the belief that its airstrike on Guadalcanal had reportedly been successful. The air contingent on the island had been largely destroyed. Thus, her death was not in vain. Well then, based on this, to Admiral Nagumo and Yamamoto, it seemed that the battle had been a resounding tactical victory. American carriers had either been heavily damaged or sunk and had fled the scene, and Henderson was basically an empty airfield. With all enemy air power neutralized, the battle was as good as won. There was no need for them to stay any longer. Nagumo withdrew north to refuel, and Kondo followed. Tanaka was told to carry on with his mission alone. He had nothing to worry about. Obviously, this assessment was based upon so much wishful thinking on behalf of the Japanese commanders. Contrary to the reports, Henderson Field was alive and well. What is incredible here is how far they've made it and yet decide not to follow through. Regardless of Yamamoto's unwillingness at having his carriers protect the convoy, it was still part of the mission. At this juncture, success of this entire operation was at stake, and they didn't even deem it necessary or even prudent enough to stick around and provide air support for the vulnerable transports. You know, just in case Henderson had survived Ryujo's devastating strike of 6 Cape bombers. Regrettably for Tanaka, no air support was given to him. And the foolishness of that decision was shown the next day when the convoy was forced back by just a mere 8 planes. Operation KA had failed. The Battle of Eastern Solomons was undoubtedly an American victory, but things could have easily gone the other way. With that said, there were mistakes committed on both sides that could be learned from. Let's take a final look at them. For the Americans, a big letdown was their radio intelligence. There were no major breakthroughs like before at Coral Sea or Midway. This time it was too vague, and it failed to detect the Japanese carriers accurately. Analysts at Hypo Station acknowledged this was in part due to Japanese efforts at improving their security. They said, success of a large task force, including carriers, in reaching the Solomons without detection by radio intelligence indicates that radio security practices of the Japanese are effective insofar as concealing actual movements is concerned. The takeaway here is that for the first time since the start of the war, intelligence had failed to accurately detect Japanese carrier movements. And I'll let you guys know now, it's not going to be the last time. During the battle, the other major shortcoming was clearly communications. Bad atmospheric conditions, human error, and malfunctioning radios led to a confusing, incomplete picture of the actual tactical situation. And I hope I was able to illustrate just how uncertain and confusing a carrier battle could be, and how important aerial reconnaissance was. Fletcher had some misfortune in that his morning search narrowly missed finding Nagumo. The afternoon search finally found him, but poor radio communications robbed him of the opportunity to strike. On the flip side, these communication blunders also bungled the Japanese in their attempt to finish off the Big E. These were universal challenges to both sides in the Pacific. Radar. The ability to destroy snoopers quickly was excellent. The first 2 snoopers were taken out before sending out any sighting reports. Only the last one was able to send the sighting report before it was destroyed, and barely at that. If it had been destroyed just a bit more quickly, Fletcher's position could have remained concealed to Nagumo throughout the battle. However, when faced with air attack, fighter radar interception proved poor. But this was more due to pilot radio discipline and technological limitations. If the problems could be fixed, like adding different frequencies for fighters to use, it showed great potential. And regarding the air attacks on Task Force 61, it was noticed by many that including a heavy battleship in the carrier screen had paid handsome dividends. It had attracted 7 of the 27 dive bombers that had attacked, and had contributed massive amounts of anti-aircraft fire for the carrier's protection. For the Japanese, they performed well, and as of August 24th, they were actually on the verge of winning. But a poor contact report, followed by an unbelievable set of communication failures, prevented them from achieving victory. Because of this, the Americans got off lightly damaged compared to what they should have. More critically, the Japanese High Command can be faulted for taking their eyes off the ball too soon. They withdrew on the 24th, not because of timidity, but because of overconfidence. They optimistically believed their pilots' wild claims of disabling 2 carriers when it had only damaged 1. Made worse was their inexplicable belief that Ryujo's meager airstrike had somehow neutralized Henderson Field. They took all reports as facts and provided no contingency plan in the event they were wrong. They didn't even provide air cover for the helpless Tanaka, who begrudgingly carried on with his mission. Their mistake was learned the next day when their unescorted convoy was turned back by just 8 aircraft. In conclusion, the Battle of Eastern Solomons showed the Japanese the brutal reality of the ensuing campaign and the key advantage their opponents now had. Henderson Field was the Americans' trump card. As long as it was operational, the Japanese could not send slow-moving transports during the day. Reassessing the situation, many saw for the first time that the battle for Guadalcanal would be a prolonged affair and not a short one as hoped. Even Yamamoto slowly began to realize that Henderson Field, not the US carrier fleet, should be the priority target for the next operation. In the meantime, a new formula would have to be figured out to bring troops safely to the island. And this will lead to one of the most iconic characterizations of the campaign, the Tokyo Express. But that will be for another video. I was going to include a bonus clip, but I'm a little worried it might affect this video, so I'm going to put it as unlisted. It's just a quick 4-minute commentary on the striking combat footage that exists of the attack on the Enterprise during the battle. You can click here to view it, or there'll be a link in the description.